We've met.
You met? Okay.
Yes, yes.
We had a
Baltimore.
wonderful lunch in Baltimore.
Right.
Last
good. Right.
February.
Hope you're all doing fine.
Yes.
And
We
particularly Carol, that you are not too nervous now.
I'm fine.
She's always cool. Always calm, always professional.
All right, so I think we can start. Do you?
Should we close the doors or not yet?
Should we close the door?
Folks might trickle.
I think Pfeffer was coming in too, but she
Yeah.
comes in, she comes in. Okay. All right, so welcome everybody to this proposal defense. The presenter today is Carol, whom you all know, Carol Danielle Kasbari, who's an important figure for us here, a very active thinker and writer and doer, and one of the people that makes this place the kind of place it is. So we're very happy presenting her proposal this afternoon. Carol, if you don't know this already about her, comes to us from Israel-Palestine, was a BA from Hebrew University, did 2 BAs, which I didn't know about, not only in Soc Anthro, which I did know about, but in French literature, in which we've never even talked about French literature. We have to do that. And has gotten her MA in NGO Administration and Public Policy, also from Hebrew University. Carol, as you all know, has been involved in practice in the Middle East, but also the whole Mediterranean area, and even a little bit over here for the last 20 years. She has operated to get people together across deep divisions, social divisions, and deep national divisions. She has a special interest in media, and has done conflict and media work of some very great importance. She speaks 4 languages. She has 2 children, 2 boys. Her husband, Sonny, is here. Welcome to you. And so this is You're Among Friends, and we're very interested to hear about the proposal. What we'll do is to follow our usual routine with this, which is to have Carol speak for about half an hour and to present the proposal, and then the committee members will ask questions about it, and then you all will get a chance to join the discussion as well. And then if we'll talk to Carol, if we have anything to tell her about the proposal going forward, we'll tell her. I want to say also that the committee is here. My colleague Dan Rothbard, sitting next to me, who you all know, and Stellan Vindhagen, who is in Sweden at the moment. And Stellan, as you may know, is really the great expert. I'm reading his book now and loving it, on resistance theory. And so he's exactly the right person to have on this committee, and I'm delighted you could be here for this proposal defense.
Thank you.
So, we turn the floor over to you, Carol. Take your half hour and let us know what this dissertation is going to be about.
All right. Thank you very much, Rich, for this introduction. And thank you all for coming here. And thank you, Daniel, for being on my committee. And thank you, Stellan, for staying up to hear this defense. So I hope really it would be interesting and worth your time. My topic, as you all know, it's on the everyday nonviolent resistance and practices and their effects on relations of power in the occupied Palestinian territories. And the purpose of this project overall is to explore and investigate the extent to which the daily practices and discourses of a subordinate group, and here I'm talking about the Palestinian case, can undermine or influence the dominating power, and here I'm talking about the Israeli occupation. And so my focus is on those daily practices that are non-organized, scattered forms of resistance, and their social, economic, political, and cultural manifestations and effects. And I'm trying to make the case here that the indigenous term, Palestinian term Sumud, actually refers to something called everyday resistance, which I will explain shortly. And so just to make clear, my research is not going to be concerned about the organized movements in the form of campaigns or movements under foreign occupation. So what is everyday resistance? Everyday resistance is a term coined by James Scott in the 80s, and it describes a form of resistance acts that are not as dramatic, visible, collective, or organized as an open revolution or civil war. The ordinary practices of a relatively powerless group are outlined in Scott's Weapons of the Week. They include foot dragging, dissimulation, full compliance, ignorance, slander, arson, sabotage, and other. These acts are called everyday because of their ordinary nature. They do not really make headlines, and they're not as risky as open resistance, while they're trying to undermine a repressive power through low-profile acts. So the pre-existing cases of everyday resistance that exist today in the world, that was started by Scott and then later on by people like Asif Bayat, and later by Van Hagen and Johansson and other researchers, they will form my theoretical template for my research. So what led me to this project, really, and why I'm interested in this? I've been following after the scholarly work that has been done on resistance in Palestine, on nonviolent resistance, and I noticed the following trends that exist in literature. First of all, there are lots and lots of research that has been done on the first Intifada, and mainly on its nonviolent nature, and mainly because of its effectiveness relatively to other forms of nonviolent resistance practiced by Palestinians, and mainly also because of Sharp's influence on the methods that were used. Even Sharp says that the first Intifada was not 100% nonviolent, it was 85% with a limited violence such as throwing stones and so on. However, it was labeled by most researchers as the first experiment of nonviolence by Palestinians, in which Palestinians used the Sharpian pragmatic strategic approach, which included a full range of tactics of omission and commission, such as strikes, protest, civil disobedience, and boycotts. However, these tactics were not really effective, or were much less effective during, before, and after the Second Intifada, for two main reasons, and this is where I'm getting to the problem. That during the Second Intifada, the increased structural fragmentation, both the external ones between Israel and the occupied territories, resulted by the separation wall, the checkpoints, the roadblocks, and so on, and the internal structural fragmentation, the divisions in areas A, B, and C, they have all resulted in social disintegration and lack of communication between the people. And so the participation was very much negatively affected by the limitation of mobility, and these have decreased any chances of planning any collective work or participate in any action or even build a campaign. So the second reason, which is overlapping in all periods of nonviolent resistance by Palestinians, is that the Palestinians did not really fulfill the three requirements of effective campaigns. Using the trajectory of civil resistance, the three elements as we all know them, unity, organization, and discipline, in the first one, the unity, Palestinians were fractured politically, for example, Hamas and Fatah fractions. In terms of organizations, they among them around the plans and around the goal and so on. And in terms of, and there was never 100% commitment for nonviolence. So it's clear that the Palestinian nonviolent resistance failed to producing any result. But these new conditions that I spoke about that resulted after the second intifada that created the divisions and the fragmentation, they still exist until this day. They did not change. And they undermine, as I said, any possibility of launching mass-based unarmed civil resistance. Actually, during the decade of, or even more, from 2003 until this day, which is the focus, the time, or the focus of my research actually, most of the research and scholarly work shows that in spite of series of localized efforts against the occupation, these efforts were fruitless in the end to build any effective campaign or mass movement. But I still notice that the researchers, famous ones like Chenoweth and Stefan and Darwish and Rigby and King and others, they still examine the Palestinian nonviolent resistance using the same lenses or the same trajectory that I just spoke about. So most of the findings on those talk about them in a negative way and as being localized, scattered, not unified or organized. And this is all true. However, this form of resistance or the nature of this resistance has been actually identified by other researchers, such as Van Hagen, as a form of resistance and a part of daily practices of a newly studied field called resistance studies that is actually focusing on everyday resistance. So what happened here? So my research is trying really to identify what are the practices, what are the categories of practices that compose the everyday resistance among Palestinians in different areas of the West Bank. These are my research questions. And what are the effects of Sumud practices on relations of power between the Palestinians and the State of Israel? And why is these two questions important, or why this research important? I think it can fill three gaps in the literature, and it can contribute in three different ways. First, as I said, the field of civil resistance had generally ignored the daily practices worldwide of resistance, but also mainly ignored, as we saw in the literature, the Palestinian practices of those nonviolent resistance because they do not follow the conventional framework. Mainly because the research overall on resistance assumes that resistance is always visible, classifiable, and recognizable. So I think that by disregarding all forms of resistance that exist, but they are much harder to package, we are here ignoring, or there is an entire realm of political engagement that is being ignored, and certain considerations of power relations and structure that are misunderstood. The second reason, I think, is given the nature of the Palestinian context and unique character as being an ongoing and protracted contemporary case of settler colonialism and military occupation. So the structural condition that prohibit the ones that I just spoke about, that prohibit any chances or possibilities for collective strategies for organized resistance, I think that studying the Palestinian daily resistance is important and groundbreaking addition to broader understanding of resistance in general. I think that by studying the Palestinian context, it might offer an opportunity to reinvestigate the concept of resistance to power, to broaden the definition of local nonviolence and local agency in general. The third one, which is related to Sumud, looking at the existing literature, Sumud as resistance has seldom been discussed academically, and usually it's framed as a survival or resilience mechanism for Palestinians. While there are a lot of descriptions in the literature that talks about the different functions of Sumud, but there is no research study with advanced theoretical arguments and models to try to attempt to understand Sumud as an everyday resistance. So what is Sumud? To start with our main keyword here. In literature, Sumud had different meanings, and they evolved throughout the years, and it's very much was influenced by the Palestinian national movement and its needs and the political context. So during crucial times, as in wars and confrontations, Sumud functioned as a national symbol or encouragement for Palestinians to stay on the land. Steadfastness, which is a passive form of Sumud, by not leaving or by having more kids. It's very much embedded in the culture. Since early age, everybody knows that Sumud is resilience or steadfastness. Sumud is also an expression of culture, identity. For example, the practices of Sumud has been culturally and artistically through different poetry, especially the poet of resistance, as we call him, Mahmoud Darwish. He's written since the 60s. Most of his poems were about belonging and about identity and so on. It also includes folklore and other cultural traditions. However, the focus of my research is not about the passive or the static modes of Sumud. It is, or its symbolic meanings, but it's on the Sumud as a nonviolent resistance. As you see in this picture here, I found that the most intriguing and active ingredient of Sumud is the small acts or the daily practices of nonviolence practiced by individuals. And these were present really from even before the first Intifada. But I assume that under the first Intifada and the development of strategic nonviolent resistance, Sumud has acquired more active meanings related to the techniques of nonviolence, such as, if you see the picture here, non-cooperation with the occupier or not obeying the rules of or the orders of soldiers. It could be as well graffitis, drawing graffitis on the wall in clashes areas or in front of Israeli checkpoints. It would be praying in the streets where there is no access to worship places like in East Jerusalem this summer. These pictures are from July this year. Or on lands, here is on the border of Bethlehem, where lands were taken by the state of Israel and Christians trying to practice, they're trying to reoccupy the land in order to pray. In this situation, farmers replanting olive trees after trees were uprooted by settlers. It could be as well standing in front of bulldozers before house is demolished, or a family who is rebuilding their house after it was demolished. Or find innovative ways, as in these creative pictures, to cross to the other side, or to climb the wall just to show the flag to the settlement across. It could be not selling houses to Israelis or settlers in the East Jerusalem West Bank, or here in this one specifically, refusal to leave the house for settlers. So these are all examples of current practices that are used. However, there is a small difference between Sumud and everyday resistance, which I need to mention. One aspect in Scott's theory of everyday resistance is that these acts of low politics or infra-politics, as he calls them, are quiet, disguised, or seemingly, as he called, invisible. However, in the Palestinian case, as you saw in these pictures, these are not quite accurate. Palestinians have adopted this as a way of life. As I said earlier, it's embedded in the cultural discourse. So, for example, when a Palestinian is rebuilding his house that has been demolished, or a person who is refusing to obey orders of soldiers, these might seem insignificant, but for a person under occupation, these are radical kind of affirmation of dignity or trying to challenge the power of the oppressor, even if they're done for personal reasons or personal survival only. But these acts are not really disguised, they're not invisible, at least not to the Palestinians or to the power holders. But they are absolutely scattered, they are individualistic, and they are localized. They're not organized in any way. So it might not be really easy to detect Sumud practices, or they might be misunderstood as political, since much of its logic is really being unorganized or hidden. So as I will show shortly, I will use a framework established by Stellan Van Hagen and Joanna Johansson in my empirical study that will enable me to map, categorize, and analyze those practices. My overall goal in this research or in this project and in my methodology is to connect the resistance of Sumud to the different configurations of power in order to understand any potential impact of the everyday resistance with regards to different configurations of power. So through this analytical framework and its 4 dimensions, which I will explain shortly, I will be able to explore how these practices respond to the power configurations of the occupation. So I'm not just focusing on Sumud as invisible or practices that are not so much visible, but I'm also operating from the framework of Neve Gordon, modes of control or Israeli occupation modes of control in the occupied territories, to try to understand what we call the invisible power techniques that are used. The source of those invisible power techniques are mentioned in the triangle of power of Foucault, which include the disciplinary power, the sovereign power, and the biopower. And these are going to be also integral to my theoretical template. So how I'm going to do that? How I'm going to answer these questions? First of all, it's important to mention that there is no established measurement for everyday resistance that exists. And there is no prior empirical study on these practices, especially there is no data on Sumud that is yet available. So what I'm proposing is a qualitative research identified through the lived experience of people. What are the practices that are present nowadays in the Palestinian society by being present in their socio-political setting? So I will do this through 2 parts. The first part will be explorative, mapping the terrain by determining how Palestinians understand and consider everyday Sumud practices. Secondly, as I said, I will categorize them and reveal the significance. So I'm gonna be using case study by following certain cases that are mentioned in literature. I will try to pin down 4 locations in the beginning that there were prior knowledge or history of nonviolent resistance. These would include places like around the Bethlehem wall area, or near religious symbols for both Jewish and Muslims in East Jerusalem, like Al-Aqsa Mosque, or in the old city of Hebron, where Palestinians or foreigners have been collaborating daily to help children get to their schools, or in villages close to Israeli settlements where there are a lot of confrontation in the Nablus area. All these locations have demonstrated histories of confrontation, so I will select these after conducting a small pilot in the field. In terms of data collection, I will be using triangulation of data, all 3 interviews, observations, and media documents. In terms of interviews, I will try to have a wide representation of the Palestinian population, gender, religious identity, age, and locations in rural areas, in refugee camps, and so on. And I will do that through purposive and snowballing sampling. The interviews will be conducting using kind of 3 categories or 3 types of interviews, and they will go into this in this order. The first people that I would like to interview are experts on Sumud or experts on power. And these people who have written about it or who have spoken or have shown some sort of a knowledge or expertise on both topics. It could be Israelis or foreigners or Palestinians. The questions for them will help me kind of identify specific practices that according to them exist. It will help me orient myself in the very beginning. Questions will then include something like what type of practices exist according to them, where according to them Sumud sites are happening more than others, what type of outcomes short-term outcome they resulted from these practices, and so on. The second group I'll be interviewing are nonviolent activists. And these are people who have been present in the field of nonviolence for a long time. So these are heroes or icons coming from nonviolent movement or campaigns, or some of them maybe been arrested or imprisoned because of their activities. So I'm interested to learn how they relate to the occupation outside of their activism world. How they treat power, how they talk about authority, and how they go along their everyday life. From these two groups of people, I hope, or these interviews, I hope to get a list of existing practices and possible outcomes that are identified by them, which I will be using in my third group to interview the Palestinian citizens. And these are people who are living mostly in clash areas, in refugee camps, or close to settlements, and so on, and or those who volunteer to talk to me about it. So I will be using semi-structured interviews, questions, and I maybe haven't mentioned it. All interviews will be conducted in Arabic, unless it's done in English or in Hebrew. For the first group of people. I will try to investigate certain practices that I have identified from previous interviews and observations. So I will ask these people open, semi-structured interviews that will focus on how they, for example, go on with their everyday life. How do they get to their work or their schools? If they faced any challenges, and if so, how? And only at the very end, I will ask about Sumud. I will not talk about it unless they mention it, or I will only ask it as a last questions of what they consider to be Sumud. The second one will be observations, and these are observations of the social settings, which means these are included in the contextual understanding of the interviews and the observed conversations, and not separated from them. So through the selected interviews, I will need to select sites where Palestinians have been known to resist in different ways, as the locations that I mentioned earlier. And so my study in the end of the day is to try to understand the behavior of the ordinary people, as well as the observers, meaning the people passing by, or myself as well as being an observer, as well as the reaction of the power holders, the reaction of Israeli authorities, which is the police and the army activities. So observations will include both the practices and the short-term or the immediate consequences of those practices. So examples would include, recently I saw it on TV, soldiers withdrawing from confrontation with Palestinians while they were negotiating with them about demolishing of a house. So they did not demolish it at the spot, they were negotiating with them. So here we're talking about something that the Palestinians have done in order to affect a sovereign power. Or on the other hand, it could be escalating and shouting and using hands and other violent ways to try to react to the practices that are done by Palestinians. It could be stuff related to closing down checkpoints because of Palestinians not obeying rules, or issues of such sort that will be included in my observations. One thing for sure, most resistance to power occurs in shared spaces. And the only shared spaces I see either around settlers area, settlements area, or in East Jerusalem. So in East Jerusalem, the possible practices that will be examined through my observations will also include those that are strengthening the power system, not just those who are weakening it or keeping it as it is, but that strengthening the. And these are happening mostly in East Jerusalem. For example, if Palestinians are participating in the Israeli municipality elections, then they are participating in enhancing the practices or helping the current system. Or if they are asking for, if East Jerusalemites residents are asking for Israeli citizenship. So it's also strengthening the power system. Or the opposite, if they are reoccupying lands in East Jerusalem or rebuilding their houses, there's a lot of demolishing of houses in East Jerusalem, or speaking Arabic in public, especially in crowded Jewish areas. These are also affirmations of the opposite, weakening the system. The third data collection tool will be the documents or media sources from the same period of time describing certain events and cases to try to identify themes that are related to Sumud practices and Sumud outcomes. These will include, for example, Palestinian speeches of Palestinian activists, intellectuals, and politicians that will demonstrate if Sumud is even presented or mentioned at all. These include videos and footages of that are related to West Bank and East Jerusalem. To target the second question related to effects or outcomes, when it comes to media, it's very clear that there are documents that demonstrate changes, for example, in policies and laws in certain sites, for example, through press releases of the Israeli military or the military court, as now we see in cases of nonviolent activists, or releases from human rights organizations about certain policies or certain measurements that were taken by Israel. So in terms of data analysis, I will be using two-level analysis. The first one will be my primary method, and it's thematic analysis, which is based on identification of recurrent themes or patterns in the data. So it will help me create the first level of categorization of Sumud. These categories would include something like preservation of culture, and language, and identity. I will include in this category acts like speaking Arabic in crowded areas, refusing to answer soldiers, raising Palestinian flags in confrontation areas. Another category I would put here, for example, from stuff that examples that I know from now, reclaiming space and access to resources such as land and water. So I will include acts like climbing the wall to get to the other side. I will include temporary occupying spaces that were taken by settlers or the state, or filing to Israeli court in order to change a ruling about home demolition, or living with a settler in the same house. Another category could include access to religious places and educational institutions. Acts like I just presented earlier, praying in the streets, or getting to spaces in spite of challenges like blockades, like getting to schools in spite of closures. So the second level of analysis is after I create all the themes and the sub-themes and those categories, I will link my thematic analysis to the literature and to the conceptual framework or the analytical framework of everyday resistance. It will guide me in my construction and analysis of the different practices and the outcomes. So these categories identified earlier in the first level will be reinterpreted in accordance to how they relate to temporality, space, social relations, and type of power. For example, who carries out the act in relation to what, and in what in time and when in space. Sorry, where in space and what in time. My overall aim is to kind of do of this second level categorization is to check how the practices relate to domination techniques and forms of power that make up the occupation. And here I will be using also Gordon's framework of power to position the outcomes and consequences in relation to the three types that are mentioned in this triangle. I will also use those dimensions, as I said earlier, to try to determine where Sumud forms do not make a difference or they are ineffective or in challenging the power relations. For example, when the intentions of the actors, which I am very interested about the intentions, are mainly survival, or when the outcomes are more integration into the existing power system. So in my investigation of these practices, I will try to determine whether it is possible to distinguish between those instances of Sumud that change power relations and those instances where it's ineffective. As I said in my analysis, it's important to focus on both the intent of the actor and the short outcome of the evaluation. It's important to mention that I'm not focusing on the long-term outcome. I will only offer short-term insights and outcomes such as I said earlier, closing down checkpoints to prevent Palestinians from crossing, that's exercising the sovereign power, or the opposite, making the waiting line shorter when Palestinians are obeying rules and being nice, so disciplinary power is being in place. So in terms of limitations, and that is my last slide. First of all, I'm very fortunate to be part of, to be a CIDR researcher and to be able to know this culture and to speak Arabic very well and Hebrew, which will help me create, first of all, trust and with my subjects and knowledge of the culture and be able to identify gaps in the data. It will help me be more efficient and comprehensive, I think. However, this comes also with issues such as objectivity, my personal preconception of the conflict. I might sometimes find myself not fully objective in some instances, so it would require me to continue to be self-reflective in this process from the outset, from the data collection, until the last writing of my report. So the second issue is really being critical or challenging to my own society, and this is something I'm famous about. There is a risk in terms of every indigenous researcher that has a critical, conducting a critical study in his or own native community. They might be kind of challenging the taking for granted views or practices of the native community. And here I am challenging myself really to being open and receptive and to views that are not so much in line with my conceptions and my views, and not being too close-minded about it. The third one, this is what is most important to me as a researcher, is not to create any tensions in the village or wherever I am doing my interviews, or not to expose danger my subjects, especially to power authorities. And that is, as you may know, that might be the case in this conflict. So I will make sure to encrypt all the material and to hide the names and to keep the safety of myself and my subjects. The last one is related to the scope of my research, and as in every research, there is a limited scope of places and periods and subjects that I can cover within a short time. So I'm only going to be studying certain sites. I'm going to be including refugee camps, for example, in the West Bank, but I'm not going to be including refugee camps in Gaza or in the Arab world. So I will be interviewing 45, 50, 60 people, but I'm not going to be interviewing everybody all over Palestine or the occupied territories. I'm not going to be interviewing Israelis, so I will not be able to say how they view Sumud or what is their opinion about Sumud or about those practices. So I can only claim some things about Sumud that in fact are happening, but not other things, or show the bigger picture, or talk about if it's going to affect the overall occupation on the long term. So I think that's it for now. Thank you all for your listening, and special thanks again for the committee and for all your help. And I'm open for feedback and questions.
Great,
Thank
that's
you.
a fine choice. Let's start with Stellan. If you,
Yeah.
Stellan, would you like to lead off on some questions or comments?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Carol. I think that was a clear summary. So, I'm thinking about the strange fact that in Palestine we see a very well developed resistance culture, and there has been limited, but there has been research done on everyday resistance around in the world, inspired by James Scott, particularly looking at peasant societies or different places, low-skilled workers, refugees, slave societies, and so on. But there hasn't been, and that's a strong legitimacy for your study, there hasn't been any systematic empirical research informed by resistance studies theory before. And that is quite strange, actually. Mm-hmm. Could you say something about how is it possible that no one's done this before?
It's a great question. I'm amazed that I found this gap. I think, first of all, because the field is relatively new. You yourself have started the resistance studies only years ago, and most of the work that has been done on this field is quite new, like 5, 6, 7 years. And I think it's very much connected to invisible practices, I think, like the one Scott's talk about, or the one Daya talks about in Egypt and in Iran. These are really, really small, covered, kind of low-profile acts that no one notices. However, in Palestine, as I said earlier, it's a little bit different. It's not invisible. And so people, when they kind of try to see the concept or the theory of everyday resistance by Scott, it might not fit 100%. It might fit 80%, but there are a lot of stuff that, there are a lot of aspects in his theory that do not really fit what exists today in Palestine. However, there is nothing that comes between the organized resistance, the civil resistance field, and the everyday resistance in order to kind of put the Palestinian everyday resistance between them. There is nothing like that. So, and I think the Palestinian case could be that bridge between the organized and the non-organized. Even though the Palestinian is non-organized, but as I'm claiming, it's not invisible. It's not invisible to the power or to those practicing it, and it's sometimes confrontational, as opposite to what Scott is actually claiming. That's non-confrontational. So there is some sort of play here, or a bridge here, that I wish, after my dissertation is done, to work on, is kind of to bridge in the next research between those two fields and kind of see how we can learn from the organized and the non-organized. But you're absolutely right, there isn't anything done, and I'm fortunate that this is the case.
But your reply there is super interesting because I would claim that if there is like a main Gordian knot of something that is super important within resistance studies to understand, it is exactly this link between the organized kind of collective public resistance that sometimes creates revolutions and the ongoing, more invisible, more informal, kind of disguised forms of everyday resistance.
Yeah.
So that places your focus directly at the heart of what I think is necessary to do in terms of the front line of everyday resistance today.
Thank you.
Stellan, what else do you, any other issues you'd like to raise?
Right. So one thing that was a little bit new for me when you mentioned it, and I'm not sure if I understood it correct, maybe you could clarify. You were saying you were interested in both practices that undermine the occupation and practices that strengthen. Could you say something more about that? Because to me it sounds like the practices that strengthen occupation would not really classify as resistance.
Right.
So
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, most of the Palestinians, or even Palestinian researchers and others who speak about Sumud, and when I was reading about Sumud, they're very much dramatizing it, and they're making it very positive, and they're making it extremely, how do you say, like this should be the goal of every Palestinian. I do not think this way. I think that there are a lot of practices nowadays that within the changes of the political situation, especially in the last 10, 15 years, that I think some Palestinians gave up, in the sense of giving, they still hold Sumud back in their mind, and they're still, you know, being raised as being, you know, nationalistic and so on and so forth. But the practices, some of those practices, even if they are unconscious or unintentional, which I do not assume, I'm still assuming that every act by Palestinian is intentional, especially when you're living under an occupying power. Some of those practices are mainly survival. And I would like to be sure that I'm not including those in my categorization. So that's why it's important to me to say what's not effective. As I said earlier, in East Jerusalem, there are lots of practices that are strengthening the power relations. There are a lot of Palestinians today that are taking the Israeli curriculum and putting it in their own schools. And they're doing that because they want the sponsorship of the Israeli Ministry of Education. So if they are learning the Israeli narrative and history and civics, that being said, you are losing your own narrative. And you are actually, and here is, you're losing the whole Sumud. Same with the Israeli asking for Israeli citizenship. People want to live, right? People cannot cross, people want to travel, they don't want to be asked for visa all the time. So when a lot of, I don't have numbers, I will be looking for numbers, but when I know that 10% or 20%, or I don't know, of those who are living in East Jerusalem are asking for Israeli citizenship, that's already an indication that this is only strengthening the power relations of Israel being the dominating power and Palestine being the minority. So it's important to use those dimensions to really kind of say where power is more effective than the practice, and where the practice is more effective than the power. And that is very important for me in this analysis. I'm not here only to say where Sumud is effective. I also came to say critically where people claim to say that they are practicing Sumud, but on the other hand, their practices are saying the opposite.
Can I jump in here too? Let me jump in.
Yes.
So I'm jumping in part. I'm partly responsible for this. So when Carol and I had one of our lengthy conversations, I mentioned to her that there's a discussion going on among Black historians, historians of the African American community, about the role of customs and activities like the black spiritual music, and black culture in general, during slave times. Because there's a well-documented theory that the spiritual was a form of resistance to slave. It helped preserve the culture, and it also expressed hopes for future liberation and stuff like that. There's another school, though, that says, well, that may have been partially true, but also it served a functional role for the master class to have the blacks focusing on being saved in the next life, not in this one, and having them singing and dancing and stuff, right? So I think what I really want to say to Carol is I like the idea very much, and I encouraged her to try to distinguish between resistance, effective and ineffective resistance, or rather to raise the question: what was the effect of resistance to perpetuate a system or to undermine it? To what extent do power relations, to use her words, get changed? And what's the meaning of that change? The problem is that it seems to me that there's a theoretical black hole when it comes to analyzing when systems are actually changing or appearing to change, or when peripheral features of the system are changing or central features of the system are changing. Our theory doesn't help us very much. I mean, there are not very good theories of system change to rely on, so that, which is illustrated when you talk about people asking for Israeli citizenship as being a system strengthener.
They are.
Well, people who are interested in the one-state solution now are starting to say everybody should apply for Israeli citizenship, because if the context is one state, then you want to be in a position to demand that state be democratic. So the ambiguities of that, so the difficulty of saying whether a form of resistance is system strengthening or system weakening or system changing or not,
You're right.
is just something. It's something that it seems to me you have to recognize. I don't say you should avoid the topic. I don't think you should avoid the topic, but I think you have to recognize that the state of theory, that in helping us to make those determinations, that the theory is very underdeveloped. And you can talk about that. I mean, what you're doing might have, play a constructive role, be a step on the road to developing a better theory. But it seems to me you don't want to dodge the subject, but also you need to recognize more than you do so far in your research, that people have been dealing with this question of system change and are struggling with it.
Absolutely. There's also something that you just said that made me think that it's not always strengthening the system if you ask for citizenship. Because now I came up with an example of a friend of mine, a Jewish one, who was just banned from entering Israel because of her activities. So her next step was, I'm going to ask for citizenship. And I asked her, why would you do that? She said, this way they cannot ban me. And I could continue doing...
Yeah, exactly.
I could continue doing what I'm doing with the Jewish Voice for Peace or whatever.
Yeah.
So that is a Sumud. That is not a Sumud. I really don't know, but it could be effective in the end of the day because she's going to be doing whatever she wants to do. But
Yeah.
it could be ineffective because you are, even in the one state, this is not going to be a binational state. This is going to be a Jewish state with a minority or levels of people that are different, have different rights and different, because they're not Jewish. Like for today, you have over 55 laws that prohibit you from so many stuff
Right.
because you're not Jewish.
Right.
So
Stellan, what do you think about this?
So I think like this, that I think it's very important to have that kind of problematizing reflection as you are suggesting here, Rich, to kind of explore in what way is something that looks like resistance actually having a more complex relationship to strengthening or undermining in different aspects, in different ways, and so on, depending on what kind of aspects we're talking about. And I think that is a feature, not just of resistance, but of many social actions here in life.
Absolutely.
That it's not just one effect, there are several at the same time. So I like that, but I think we have to keep a very clear focus here, also for helping Carol to not make the dish too big.
Right.
Is to keep the focus on the immediate effects. Because if she starts to discuss the more long-term things, it's going to be impossible. It's a whole research project in itself.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Stellan, what else anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I mean, I have discussed intensively with Carol different aspects of it, so I don't think at this point there's more questions that I really have. But
Okay.
I could ask things that because I would like Carol to expand on it, but maybe it's better if I can come back again.
Okay, thank you. Good.
Okay.
Dan?
Yes. Well, this topic is one of the themes I want to address. But let me just say, this is really terrific to see your progress. I feel like I've been with this project with you, obviously not sharing the work and pain that you've gone through, but every stage I see progress. And here what we have is absolutely a successful proposal. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. And I'm not going to, just to get to the practicality here, I'm not going to suggest any change, Rich, in the proposal. And so, so when I look at something like this, as you've heard me many times, I'm trying to see, does it all fit together? Carol, does it all fit together? That's a key question. But let me just preface by saying what I think is obvious. You are embarking on such an innovative topic for reasons that we already heard from my colleagues on this committee, and an important topic, obviously, and your expertise is obvious. So just a couple points that I'm going to suggest for your future work as you move forward to get the job done, okay? And you have really gone a long way towards the dissertation itself. You know, in the literature research, literature review is excellent, and so on. Some things, a couple things notable. I really appreciate and think of great value the way you framed the multiple meanings of Sumud. So we always had this question, you know, meaning. So you don't want a single meaning, fine. Okay, but you have to give readers, to make it convincing, certain dimensions of the life form of Palestinians. What does that mean? It can't be everything, it has to be focused. So the way you have this is really, I think, excellent. So basically you have Sumud as expression of survival and so on. So these I see as forms of life with each having its own discourse. So this is a discourse of survival and so on. And the evidence, of course, as you mentioned, are the practices. It's kind of, Rich, I would suggest it's a habitus that's really going on here. It's kind of a skilled practice that draws upon the past with a vision to the future. In terms of, so anyway, so that I think you should continue and deepen, and you will deepen as you get data. You know, as you get that, and you'll fit that in. By the way, parenthetically, any proposal is just like, maybe it's a good idea. Okay?
Yeah.
In other words, you know, this seems like a good idea, is how I read every proposal from an author. Because when you get the details of what you're doing, and you're going to try to fit it in to conceptual frames that you talked about, which may seem very reasonable, it's not always going to fit. And so you know, tweaking of the conceptual models is totally common and will be necessary. So the question 2. So we talked about this before. So the relations to power. So I'm trying to think of the sequence of your activity to answer question 2 about how does Sumud relate to possible changes in relations of power, and it really to the state. So that might be too ambitious, okay? Because as I think Stellan pointed out, which I agree with, you can get evidence of what happens in the scene. Okay, so say you have a confrontation, and you're gathering evidence of the confrontation, and you see basically a confrontation. I mean, everything is always power and reaction to power in a small scale. Obviously, it's microscopic. So you're going to be able to get that evidence of what the soldiers do, or what they don't do, or what does not happen, which is important. There's not a reaction by the militants or something like that. You had a great picture of the climbing up the wall. So maybe there's not a reaction. Okay, so you're going to get data on that, and that's great. Now, how then going to the hallways of power from that? In other words, think back from an immediate episode to the halls of power, the invisible, the structure, as Rich was talking about. The instruments of power of the structure. That move from the microscopic scene, to the halls of power, to the real instruments of power. And you're going to ask, did that change? And that's what I'm saying is going to be very hard to find, to figure out. It's going to be very hard to get evidence. And so I'm just preparing, suggesting it might be too hard. You know? So from my standpoint, if you get evidence of the scene, you know, the data that you were saying, observing and interviewing, which by the way, I think interviewing the participants would be ideal. I don't think, you didn't quite say that in your presentation, the participants of the intervention itself.
I spoke about 3 types of interviews.
Right, among the Palestinians, are you going to, it would be great if you could interview the participants of an intervention, of a confrontation with the...
You are proposing,
You're planning?
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
So all that is fine, and what I'm suggesting is that to fully answer number 2, you'd have to dig deep into where, like a black hole of the, talk about invisible.
So
Well,
I think
let me suggest a way of dealing with this too, because I made a note here, and I won't have any further questions after that. I made a note here that when you were talking about the power relations, you said, what do the police and the army do? And I made a note here saying, what about Israeli public opinion and the opinion makers and the decision makers? If you were analyzing, say, the events in the U.S. civil rights movement, even though that was an organized movement, and you wanted to say, well, what was the effect of on power of the March on Selma or what have you? You would have to say people saw it on television and it changed the whole way the country thought about about the relations. So, keeping in mind, I agree entirely with Stelwyn, you have to be focusing on immediate consequences. The immediate consequences might go beyond what the police and the army did.
Absolutely.
It might be also do what did Haaretz or the Jerusalem Post say, or
Right.
right? So that's all. I mean, I think that partly fills in the gap that Dan is talking about. That you don't just talk about what the cops do, you also talk about more general results, if there are any. I mean, if it's invisible, it's invisible. But if it's not, then there are probably going to be reactions.
Part of my data collection tools is media and
Okay.
sources. So it will include, as I said, not just speeches, but also social media, as well as the reaction of the authorities to those. And I said that I will be following on press releases, I will be following on articles and stuff like that appears in the Israeli mainstream media. But just to maybe what you're saying is extremely important for me, and I want to just clarify. I mean, I want to ask: do you mean that I don't think that I want to say something about the overall power?
Yeah, okay.
I want to say something about the immediate power,
Good.
not just the immediate practice.
Okay.
So when I say the sovereign power, I mean what is happening in the legal system in Israel about a certain case of a Palestinian who is trying to reoccupy his house, reoccupied by settlers. I want to say something about checkpoint being closed because of certain, so the sovereign, disciplinary. I want to say something about Palestinians smiling and that made Israelis close the checkpoint because they're not obeying. So that's an immediate.
Good, that's
Now,
exactly what I'm suggesting.
No, I'm not talking about the
Right.
overall power. I cannot claim something about, the overall power. That's beyond my
Okay.
research focus.
Okay, so it's just a matter of clarifying the
Yeah.
objective. So you don't want to say, when you write this again, it's a little misleading to say that you're talking about relations of power to the state of Israel. It's just, but what you just said is obviously terrific. I mean, it basically confirms that the methodology you're using will be sufficient. I mean, that's the whole point of methodology, is to come up with a persuasive answer to your question. And that is fine.
So maybe I need to reframe the question.
It's just tweaking the question.
Tweaking the question.
For the future,
Yeah.
again, for the future. Just a matter of tweaking, because I
Future
wasn't
is-
sure about that question. Related to that is this issue of effectiveness. I'm going to suggest that your project is again, highly commendable. The challenge of effectiveness are so multi-layered and deep and complicated, for some of which the reasons we just heard from my colleagues. I mean, one problem with the question of effectiveness is, what's the scope of your of judging the effectiveness? Is it small scale? Is it the community? Is it the state? Is it then you get the time. Is it the current people who are subjected to some oppressive event? Is it their children? And so on. So if you don't, if you kind of do, Stellan's suggestion I really like, that address the challenge. If you simply address the challenges with judging the effectiveness of Sumud and kind of put off the question for your second huge project after graduating, the second or third book, okay, then that's fine with me. Okay, Rich?
Yep,
I mean,
absolutely.
if you don't, because what I don't want to happen is you have inadequate data, and an unconvincing argument for you to say, this was very effective.
So you're just upfront and self-conscious about what you're doing. When you talk about effectiveness,
Yeah.
you say, this is the scale that I'm using. I'm talking about effectiveness here and now in this community.
Yeah, that's
Period. And I think as long as you're clear about you're not using effectiveness in this kind of vague sense, then I think you're okay.
Yeah, like evaluation of practice.
Then I
This
think
whole
you're
field of practice evaluation is incredibly complicated and controversial.
Right.
So I'm suggesting you should avoid it, or not avoid it, but at least address it in terms of the complexity of it.
Also because, just to continue your recommendation, also in the exam, one of the exam questions was about the effectiveness of everyday resistance in the world to bring cases from the world. So one thing for sure is, after reading about a lot of cases in the world, I saw that there's no whatsoever measurement for effectiveness
Is that
of
right?
everyday.
Okay.
No, there isn't. There isn't like the lenses of civil resistance field, the unity organization discipline. There is none. There is nothing. So in each case, as you saw in the exam, it was all about the number of people,
Right.
what changes happened in the end of the day because of what the Egyptians have done or the Iranians have done or whatever it is. It was not really, the only one who brought some sort of an evidence for changes was Bayat, and in his research on Egypt, through the maps, how Egyptians occupied whole neighborhoods and whole areas because of their actions against the state. So that map that showed what happened within 10 years and 20 years and so on, that's the only measurement for effectiveness. But there is no, I think, measurement for effectiveness.
Good, then you don't have to make it up.
Yeah.
For this book.
Yeah. In that book, I think Stellan will take
That'll be
this
the next
admission.
Okay, Dan, anything else?
Yes, I think that's
You happy?
that's it. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you to the committee for their questions, and now we'll open it up for anybody who'd like to either ask a question or make a comment briefly, we hope, but as fully as you like. And would you introduce yourself, Stellan?
Yeah, I'm Charles Davidson, a third-year PhD candidate here at the school. I have two really quick questions and one question that's not a very good question, but I'm still curious about it. When you said during your interviews that you would be asking them at the very end, like, what they consider to be Sumud, am I understanding correctly that you're not going to like directly ask them how they express it, but simply how they conceptualize of it? Or did I misunderstand that?
So, because I don't want to put words in the mouths of ordinary people, or people who are just going on with their lives, maybe they don't have it in their mind, and maybe, and so on. So part of the people, there will be nonviolent activists who would know more or less from my research question what I'm talking about, but most of the people who I'm going to be interviewing, I want them to tell me how they're going on with their daily life without me kind of orienting them to where I want to go. And so yes, at the very end, after if they mention it in their answers, then I will take a question from their answer and build on it. But they're not mentioning it at all. I'm not gonna be directing them in any way. So, and I will ask that question to see what do they think about it. How, and if they think about it as a term, or as a culture, or as a tradition, or they think about it as an act, or as a practice. That's what I'm interested in.
Okay. My handwriting is terrible. You said that Sumud occurs mostly in public, or small acts of resistance occur mostly in public.
In shared areas.
Shared area. Okay, in shared area.
Shared with Israelis.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it can be an individual solitary act alone, as long as it's in a shared area.
Yes.
I understand. Okay. That answers that question. The final one. This kind of goes back to more my teenage years. When I was a younger guy, I remember like committing acts of vandalism when I was young and living in the poor part of town, for really like no conceptualizable reason other than that I felt like causing trouble, and I was young.
Right.
How do you? I think you spoke a little bit to that, but how are you going to be able to differentiate between a cognizant act of resistance and just kids being kids?
First of all, it's all about intention. If they're expressing in their answer some sort of anger about the dominating power, or anger about their parents, that's another issue. You know,
Yeah.
it's really totally another issue. So it's all in the questions, I think, and in me knowing, being raised there all my life, living there all my life, I could know, if the person is talking from a place of anger from his family or his girlfriend, or from the power system.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Sometimes it's not so easy to make that distinction. I remember when I was doing anti-war stuff in Chicago, we got denounced by any number of people as basically acting out anti-parental, our anti-parental.
Yeah.
Yes.
So my name is Fakhra. Hi, Sterling. I heard about you from Carol. I'm Carol's friend, and I'm a PhD student here, and also dealing with the issues of power and identity. And it's fascinating proposal, Carol. Like, I was so impressed by the control of the theories that you brought to this proposal. So I want to say what was missing for me, and also something to suggest. So in this presentation, what was missing for me, the context of the occupation to be presented, like that you didn't present the context of to be occupied by Israel. So somehow the master was invisible in this presentation. So in order to see the power, and when it's invisible, we don't see the power of the people. So for me, I think maybe because of safety of time, but I would recommend to give introduction. What is it to be occupied by people for like 70 years, and to anchor us in this context, which will give a different size of the Sumud and what you are saying. But I'm sure that this is something that we live it, but it was missing for me the context to be presented, and also to see the master visible for us in this presentation, which was missed.
I think in some of the pictures where I showed the soldiers
I
and
know,
the
but-
checkpoints and the wall, this is the master.
Yeah, but I mean,
In the dissertation,
in the
you're
dissertation, you will bring
respond
it.
to this.
Oh, yes, yes, of course.
Yeah, so.
For the
so-
outsiders.
Can I suggest, so, yeah, in the background lit review or something, in the dissertation, I think it's worth a section
Yeah.
on the nature of power of the Israeli state. I mean, kind of, background info.
So it
on
will
that,
it will anchor us in different contexts.
Yeah,
It's in the Nev Gordon material that she's got. A lot of
Yeah, I
it
am
is- a lot of
sure.
it is in there.
It's in the proposal, but it's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
in
Well,
the
it
PowerPoint.
it could be more.
Yeah, I
Could be
guess
more, it would
I
be
guess
more.
here you, because of safety of time, to save the time, but yet I guess it was good if we anchored
be more.
ourselves in that context. It will give more power for your argument, totally. And what I maybe suggest for the interviews, it's like if you are going, the sumud and the effectiveness can be from the people themselves, like to ask them if they think their actions maybe have a different, because this is an action that they will repeat it, or maybe I'm taking you for another direction, but you can also in the interviews see if they think their actions make a difference or not, and also to interview professionals that in the community that are like observing that action. So because you want to interview professional, which is amazing resource for you, but you can like take a case study and interview the people that participate, and also interview the professional or the activists in that community, so it will support you to shape together if this act is effective or not, because they will be your resources, and they are the community that evaluate their actions and take it further. It's just a recommendation. It might change for you or the
Thank
whole
you.
method.
Thank you. Thank you. Other comments? Mary, you want to ask a question?
Well, I just want to make a comment. Carol Carol, you have come so far since that research trip we took in Brazil in defining and just putting together something that is so credible and makes so much sense. And I'm so pleased for you. You did a tremendous job today.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We had so many conversations about research questions. I drove her nuts.
Any other comments?
It's very rich proposal.
Any other comments? Okay, well, thank you all for those comments and questions. Perhaps we should chat for a minute.
Yeah.
Let us talk, you leave us
We have
alone
to
for
ask you
just a
to
couple
leave.
of minutes.